There's no black people on Game of Thrones. This is the InSight. Personally, I've been sick of black people on TV. After years of scandal, empire, and even reports from shows I don't even watch, like EastEnders, I have learned to appreciate the sweet bliss of a television program featuring little to no black characters whatsoever, which incidentally is what allowed me to somewhat enjoy Game of Thrones. Here was a show by white people, about white people, explicitly based upon the history of white people. The detachment that came from not seeing a reflection of my image on the screen was poetic, allowing my obligatory analysis to center around the pathology of Eurocentric fantasies and such matters. That was until the beginning of the 8th and final season. The TV rendition of the Song of Ice and Fire was coming to a crescendo. Winter was most certainly here, and the cries of lack of black characters resurfaced, primarily with a Guardian article entitled, "There are no black people on Game of Thrones. Why is fantasy TV so white?" Whatever your perspective on the question, it is an interesting one to explore. The article is right. From Game of Thrones to Lord of the Rings to the Chronicles of Narnia, we are all bombarded by tales of white people existing in lily-white fantasy universes. While them thrones does dot the odd blackhead among the cotton wool, it may also provide some examples as to what actually happens when benevolent casting directors do pity us enough to throw us a bone. Check it. Missandei and Grey Worm, the longest standing melanated persons with speaking roles in the entire 8-season run. Him, the castrated leader of a slave army. Her, a formerly enslaved servant and translator. Both in the service of the blonde would-be queen of the 7 kingdoms. One speaks her words, the other fights her battles. And while in her service, they find love. Check your favorite TV shows. Even among shows with significant black characters, positively affirming black male-female relationships does not seem particularly high on the mainstream agenda. So isn't it interesting that one of the few significant black love relationships takes place between a formerly enslaved black woman and a castrated black man, making it impossible for them to develop and pass down a legacy in a show that is all about developing and passing down a legacy? Or so you contemplate when you're a super black conscious hotep with a bit of time for the White Walker's moving image projections. But maybe that's just me. Whatever the case, this line in the Guardian article raised an important question. Quote, "Since our society's contemporary concerns include diversity and representation, it makes sense that Game of Thrones would be gradually moving in that direction." Keywords, diversity and representation. 2 words that highlight our desire to be featured in the lily-white worlds of others without ever questioning, why do we even want to feature in their lily-white worlds in the first place? Is that truly the best we have to offer? George R.R. Martin is a white American who understands where his roots lay. Naturally, when drawing on inspiration to create his world, his mind wandered across the ocean blue to Europe, to his historic and cultural center.
I always loved history, and European history more than American history for some reason. American history was fine, you know, Civil War, World War II, Revolution, all that stuff. But there was something that made me more attached to the Kings of England and the 100 Years' War and the Crusades. I mean, that evoked my imagination. The War of the Roses was one of the original inspirations. The War of Roses was fought between the Yorks and the Lancasters, and I have the Starks and the Lannisters. The War of Roses was a contest for the English throne that lasted over several generations. There were some amazing, colorful personalities on both sides. There were constant reversals. It was not an easy war. One side won and the other side won and the first side came back. But mixed into that was family loyalties and love and sex and all this incredible stuff.
Perfectly reasonable to me. From King Arthur to Hercules to Ben-Hur and so much more, we are immersed in the myths and legends of Europeans given to us by Europeans who know their cultural center. The reproduction of these narratives gives them an opportunity to reinforce and promote this cultural center, which raises another obvious set of questions, beginning with, what are the myths and legends of African culture, and where are the writers, directors, and producers developing these myths and legends for our contemporary cultural reality? Maybe if we were less concerned with diversity and representation and more concerned with cultural agency and ownership, we would be better placed to answer these questions. Baba Aikwe Amar explores precisely these themes in his great and illuminating book, The Eloquence of the Scribes, a memoir on the sources and resources of African literature. He begins by exploring how colonial education developed an artificial inclination towards European literature. Quote, thinking back, it occurs to me that under logical circumstances, my growth would have taken me into a school system in which my initial fascination with narrative forms like Abakosem and Anansisem I brought from home might have deepened into increasingly systematic specialized studies in fiction, drama and poetry on the one hand, the equivalent of Anansisem, and on the other hand, history, philosophy, sociology, the equivalent of Abakosem. The educational progression this would have entailed could have been entirely natural. He goes on to say, what happened to Anansisem and Abakosem during my stay at Achimota, his secondary school? Academically, they simply fell off the screen. They ceased to exist as significant narratives. As for the actual study of literature in colonial times, it was structured as an invitation into the world of opportunity and power. We were encouraged to admire this world initially as outsiders to whom much that an English reader might be expected to know from life had to be explained. Snow, flowers, animals, customs, a myriad of references that were necessarily arcane to us. Tacitly, this new world opening up to us in such abstract fashion was presented as the only worthwhile world. Baba Aikwe Amar goes on to correct this folly of history, outlining an illustrious African literary tradition from the ancient scribes of Kemet to the griots of the so-called Middle Ages and the post-colonial period. He concludes by laying out pathways for the future development of African narratives, particularly in fiction. One author with an imagination sparked by his own cultural lens is my brother Tahaka, aka Captain Scarlet, host of the Scattered Mind show. Recently, I caught up with him to discuss his use of the Mali Empire as a source of inspiration for African fantasy fiction and world building.
I have to keep it real, you know, I'm a boy of Jamaican parentage, growing up here in the West, so there's inspirations drawn from all over the place. But you know, we'll get into it throughout the interview, but obviously growing up reading fantasy fiction, you're looking for the reflection of yourself and thinking, where can I find it? And having someone going to Saturday school and learning about our history and learning about our culture, seeing King Shaka Zulu and all that, from a young age, I'm like, yo, this is source quality, do you know what I mean? It's quality source stuff to write any story from, so I've always been inspired to write that sort of
I want to ask you, like, why did you pick, well, are you basing it primarily in Mali, or, like, so what was the inspiration behind that specifically?
I suppose I knew a little bit about Mali history, having been reading about it from, obviously, looking into Islamic history within Africa, so I knew a little bit about Mali, but then I drew, like, the stories that came to me were very inspirational, and I've been looking to do a story in Africa for a while, and I thought about doing something in Ethiopia, because I knew about Ethiopian history. I thought about doing something in South Africa, but when I got Mali and I looked at like the history of Mali and sort of the medieval period of Mali and the Malian Empire, of the hierarchy of the Mansa, the Farin class, the Ferrari class is what they're called, the Kelekuns, the warheads, and all the Wangara, these merchant chiefs that walked around. So these roles almost wrote themselves. And so once we found it, like, okay, this story is writing itself. And then because I had all that knowledge of those other kingdoms, I was like, I have to incorporate the interaction somehow.
So, with such a powerful legacy to build upon, should black actors, actresses and audiences be struggling for recognition in white fantasies? If black representation matters, how can black ownership not matter? Would we be so concerned with featuring in their lily white worlds if we were creating our own universes? Those are the questions, and this is the InSight. Peace and blessings, family. Firstly, apologies, for delaying in bringing the insight to you, but we're back. Do want to hear your viewpoints on this season of Game of Thrones in general, and particularly the issue of the black characters. And finally, before I close, let me just highlight this book right here by a young writer from the UK entitled Chiamaka Nicely. It's called The Masterpiece. Excellent fantasy fiction. Do check it out at nicelypublishing.com. nicelypublishing.com. Shout out to Chiamaka Nicely. You're doing your thing, family. And you don't know, kings and queens, as always, like, subscribe and comment, and we'll see you in a couple of weeks' time for another edition of The Insight. Peace.
gotKushTV is supported by Better Marketing Mastery, Defenders Entertainment, The Hidden Science Academy, Black History Walks, Centre of Pan-African Thought, the Manhood Academy for Boys, the Al-Qaeda and Revivalist Movement, and Marifa Circle.